Delia collapsed in my kitchen at 11 at night, doubled over the counter clutching her side, and by the time we got to the ER, her appendix had already started making decisions neither of us were ready for. We'd been halfway through a bottle of wine and an argument about whether her cat was secretly plotting against both of us when she went pale mid-sentence, set down her glass with unusual care, and said, in a voice too controlled to be anything but genuinely alarming, "Something's wrong. I need you to drive me to the hospital right now." The 20-minute drive felt considerably longer. Delia curled against the passenger door, jaw clenched against pain she was clearly trying to downplay for my benefit. Both of us running through the specific mental checklist of every worst-case scenario neither of us wanted to say out loud. I've spent a decade as an EMT, seen enough emergency rooms to know the particular urgency in a triage nurse's face that means things are moving faster than routine, and I recognized it the second we walked through those doors. The quick assessment, the immediate wheelchair, the specific controlled hustle of a medical team that had already decided this wasn't going to wait. The intake nurse handed her a clipboard with a consent form clipped to it, told her someone needed to sign as her legal decision-maker in case anything went wrong on the table, and Delia, pale and sweating and 20 minutes from surgery, looked at the form, looked at me, and wrote, "Rowan Hale, husband," in the relationship line without so much as a flicker of hesitation. Delia, "Don't," she said, gritting through the pain. "My parents are 4 hours away. You're the only person in this city who's allowed to make a decision for me if something goes wrong tonight. I'm not risking a hospital bureaucrat telling you best friend doesn't count when it matters." You could have just written emergency contact. There's a whole separate line for that. There's also a chance some overworked resident decides emergency contact doesn't carry the same legal weight if there's a genuine decision to make mid-surgery. I did the math in about 4 seconds, Rowan. Husband was the fastest way to make sure nobody questions your standing if it actually matters. That's either extremely practical or slightly unhinged. Probably both. Ask me again once I'm not about to lose an organ. I'm Rowan Hale, 35. I work as an EMT, which means I've spent a decade around hospitals, watching other people's worst nights unfold from the outside. Standing in one as the person signed onto a stranger's clipboard as husband was, even for me, an entirely new category of surreal. I'm going to back up, because the appendix and the clipboard aren't actually where this story starts. Delia Marlowe and I have known each other since 9th grade, 17 years. Most of them spent as genuinely inseparable best friends, the kind of friendship that survives college in different states and jobs on opposite coasts, and the specific slow erosion that usually kills less durable friendships somewhere around year 10. We'd been each other's constant through a decade and a half of ordinary chaos. My parents' divorce sophomore year, her first heartbreak junior year, 4 years of long-distance phone calls while I went to a state school 2 hours from home and she went cross-country for veterinary school. The specific rhythm of two people who kept choosing to stay close even when geography made it inconvenient. She moved back to the city 8 months ago, taking a position at a veterinary practice 2 neighborhoods from my station, and we'd fallen back into the old rhythm almost immediately. Sunday dinners, emergency contact status on each other's medical forms, the specific, comfortable shorthand of two people who'd known each other since braces and bad haircuts. I'd forgotten, in the years she'd been gone, how easy it was to be around her, how quickly the old jokes and shorthand came back once she was physically present again, instead of just a voice on the other end of a phone call. There's a piece of that history I hadn't told anyone, not even my own sister, in 17 years of carrying it. The summer before senior year, at a bonfire neither of us fully remembers the details of anymore. Someone's lake house, the specific hazy warmth of a night that had gone on longer than anyone planned. Delia and I ended up sitting apart from the rest of the group, close enough that our shoulders touched, talking about nothing important in the specific low voices people use once a party has thinned out to just the people who actually matter. Somewhere in that conversation, without either of us fully deciding to, we came about 4 inches from kissing, both of us leaning in at the same moment, both of us pulling back at the exact same second like we'd rehearsed it. and neither of us ever mentioned it again. I remember the specific panic of that pullback more clearly than almost anything else from that entire summer. The sudden mutual understanding that we'd both felt the same pull and both gotten scared of it at the same instant. Neither of us brave enough to be the one who leaned back in. We drove home that night talking about something else entirely, some deliberately mundane subject neither of us actually cared about, both performing normalcy so thoroughly that by the time we said goodnight, it was almost possible to believe the moment hadn't happened at all. 6 weeks later, her family moved across the country for her father's job, and whatever that almost moment might have become got quietly buried under a decade and a half of long-distance friendship instead. I never stopped thinking about it, if I'm being fully honest. Not obsessively, not in a way that stopped me from living my life or dating other people over the years, but it stayed there. A small, unexamined question I never let myself fully unpack, especially not once she moved back and the friendship resumed like no time had passed at all. The surgery took 90 minutes. I spent every one of them in a waiting room chair, still holding the clipboard the nurse had eventually taken back, staring at the specific, absurd weight of a word Delia had written in a moment of pure medical logistics that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with hospital bureaucracy. Husband. Written in her familiar handwriting. Underlined once, like she'd known exactly what she was doing, even through the pain. I texted her parents an update, called my captain to explain why I wouldn't be in for my shift, and spent the rest of the 90 minutes doing the specific, useless math people do in waiting rooms, running through every version of what could go wrong, every complication I'd personally witnessed in a decade of emergency medicine, unable to fully quiet the professional part of my brain that knew exactly how quickly a routine appendectomy could turn into something considerably worse. A doctor came out afterward, told me the surgery had gone smoothly, no complications, she'd be groggy for a while but fully fine. I wanted on record that husband apparently carries real weight in a hospital's information sharing policies, because that doctor spoke to me with a level of medical detail I'm fairly certain wouldn't have been extended to best friend since 9th grade under normal circumstances. The specifics of the inflamed appendix, the surgeon's assessment of her recovery timeline, details I suspected I wasn't technically entitled to but received anyway, courtesy of a single word on a clipboard. I sat with her in recovery for another hour, watching her drift in and out of anesthesia fog, holding her hand mostly because it seemed like the thing a person in my assigned role was supposed to do, not fully examining why it felt like considerably more than an assigned role by the third time she squeezed back without fully waking up. She surfaced properly around 4 in the morning, blinking against the fluorescent lights, focusing slowly on my face. "You stayed," she said, voice rough from the anesthesia. "Where else would I go? I'm your husband, apparently, according to hospital paperwork." She managed a weak laugh that clearly hurt her incision. "Don't make me laugh. It's not funny yet. Ask me again in a week." Noted. Filing that under things to revisit once you're not held together by staples. "Thank you," she said, more seriously, her hand finding mine again, deliberate this time instead of an unconscious reflex. "For staying. For signing whatever they needed signed. For not making it weird that I just declared you my husband to a room full of medical professionals without asking permission first. I would have signed anything to get you into that operating room faster, Delia. Husband, emergency contact, next of kin, whatever the form needed." "Careful," she said, eyes already drooping again with exhaustion. "I might start believing you mean that in ways beyond the paperwork." I didn't say anything back to that. I told myself, sitting there in the specific gray light of a hospital room at 4 in the morning, that she was heavily medicated, that whatever she'd just said didn't carry the weight I wanted it to carry, that reading too much into a half-conscious comment from a woman recovering from emergency surgery was exactly the kind of boundary violation I'd promised myself. 17 years ago after that bonfire, I would never let myself commit. I want to be honest about the days that followed, because they mattered more than that single hospital night. I stayed close during her recovery, driving her home once she was discharged, stocking her fridge with soup and the specific ginger ale she'd always sworn cured everything since we were teenagers. Sitting with her through the first uncomfortable week of healing while she complained, colorfully, about the indignity of needing help standing up from a couch. I took 2 personal days from the station, something I'd almost never done in a decade of the job, and my captain, who'd met Delia exactly once at a department barbecue years earlier, didn't ask many questions when I explained the situation. Just told me to take whatever time I needed and get back when I could. "This is humiliating," she informed me on day 3, attempting to reach a cabinet and wincing at the pull on her incision. "I'm a veterinarian. I perform surgery on other creatures. I should not be this pathetic about my own body." "You're allowed to be pathetic for a week. It's practically hospital mandated." "I hate this." "I know. Sit down before you tear a stitch and make both our nights considerably worse." She sat, grudgingly, and I got whatever she'd been reaching for, and this became its own small ritual over that first week. Her attempting some minor task, me intervening, her complaining about the intervention while clearly grateful for it anyway. We fell into an easy domestic rhythm neither of us had planned for, me cooking simple meals in her kitchen while she supervised from the couch, both of us working through an embarrassing number of reality television episodes neither of us would normally admit to watching, the specific, comfortable closeness of 2 people who'd known each other long enough that even an unglamorous recovery period felt more like an extended sleepover than an inconvenience. "You know," she said on day 4, watching me attempt to fold laundry with considerably less skill than the task required, "most best friends would have handled this with a casserole and a phone call. You've basically moved in. Would you rather I hadn't?" "No," she admitted, quieter than her usual deflecting tone. "I think I'd have been genuinely lonely without you here." That's a strange thing to admit about a broken appendix, but here we are. It was on day 5, over reheated soup at her kitchen table, that the subject of the clipboard finally came up directly, both of us apparently having avoided it by unspoken agreement, until she felt steady enough to actually examine it. "I've been thinking about the husband thing," she said, stirring her soup without really eating it. "I wrote that without thinking, honestly. Pure survival instinct, wanting to make sure you had legal standing in case anything went wrong. But then I kept turning it over the last few days, and it stopped feeling like a lie exactly. It felt like the truest available word for what you actually are to me, even if it's not technically accurate." I set down my own spoon, feeling something shift in the room. The specific charged quiet before a conversation that's been circling for 17 years finally lands somewhere real. "Can I tell you something?" I said, "that I've never told anyone, including you, in 17 years of knowing each other?" "Always." "The bonfire. Senior year, before your family moved. I've never stopped thinking about that moment. Not constantly, not in a way that ruined my life or anything, but it's been there. This small, unexamined thing, for a decade and a half. I think some part of me has been quietly waiting to see if it would ever come back up again." Delia went very still, something careful and hopeful moving behind her eyes. "I think about it too," she admitted. "More than I've ever told you. I used to wonder, especially after I moved away, whether we'd chickened out of something that actually mattered, or whether it would have ruined everything if we hadn't." "Do you remember the specifics? I've replayed it enough times that I'm honestly not sure how much of my memory is accurate anymore versus just worn smooth from overuse. I remember you were wearing that ridiculous flannel you refused to stop wearing that entire year. I remember the fire had died down to mostly embers, and everyone else had wandered off toward the lake, and it was just us on that log. And for about 4 seconds, neither of us said anything at all. I remember the silence. I don't remember the flannel, but I'll take your word for it. It was truly a terrible flannel, Rowan. I want that on the record before we get too nostalgic about the whole evening." I laughed, some of the vulnerability of the moment easing slightly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't pulled back? If one of us had just been brave enough to close those 4 inches instead of both chickening out at the same second?" "Constantly, if I'm honest. I used to run through it in college sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep. Whether we'd have dated through senior year and burned out before graduation, the way most high school relationships do. Whether the move would have broken us up anyway, just with more heartbreak attached. Whether we'd never have stayed friends at all if we'd tried the other thing first and it hadn't worked. I don't know which it would have been. I know I've spent 17 years not finding out because I was terrified of losing the friendship if I was wrong about what it meant. I've been terrified of the exact same thing. I think that's actually why I wrote husband on that clipboard without thinking. Some cowardly, honest part of me has apparently been rehearsing that word for longer than either of us have been willing to admit. We didn't rush anything past that conversation, that particular evening. Delia was still recovering, still exhausted, still working through the specific vulnerability of major surgery, and neither of us wanted whatever came next to get tangled up with the recovery itself. But something had shifted, unmistakably, the specific charged awareness of two people who'd finally named a 17-year-old almost thing directly instead of letting it stay comfortably buried. I called my sister that same night, mostly because I needed to say the whole tangled story out loud to someone who wasn't directly involved in it. "Let me get this straight," my sister said, once I'd finished explaining the clipboard, the bonfire. 17 years of unexamined almost, and the soup conversation that had finally cracked it all open. "You've been sitting on a 17-year crush. Your best friend accidentally declared you her husband on hospital paperwork during an actual medical emergency. You finally had one honest conversation about it over soup. And now what? What's the actual plan?" "We're taking it slow. She's still recovering." "Slow is fine. Slow is not the same as another 17 years of nothing, though. I love you, but you're historically not great at converting feelings into action in any kind of reasonable time frame." "That's uncomfortably accurate. I'm allowed to be accurate. I've watched you not mention this woman's name for over a decade whenever the subject of your teenage years came up, which in retrospect was clearly not a coincidence. Don't let this stall out just because the initial conversation happened. Follow through. I'm planning on it, properly, once she's fully healed and this doesn't get tangled up with recovery logistics." I spent the next 2 weeks in a strange, hopeful limbo, watching Delia's recovery progress from cautious shuffling to something closer to her normal energetic self. Both of us circling the unspoken understanding that something real was building between us, without either of us rushing to name it fully just yet. We fell into an easy new rhythm, dinners that had started as recovery obligations slowly becoming something more deliberately chosen, small touches that lingered a beat longer than platonic friendship usually allowed, both of us testing the new territory carefully, neither wanting to move faster than the other was ready for. "You've been staring," she told me one evening, catching me watching her laugh at something on television instead of actually watching the show myself. "I have been. I'm allowed to, apparently, given the soup conversation." "You're allowed to. I'm just noting it for the record. You used to be considerably more subtle about it." 17 years of subtlety got us exactly nowhere, Delia. I'm trying a new approach. 3 weeks later, mostly healed, Delia invited me to a small gathering at the veterinary practice where she worked, a low-key celebration for a colleague's promotion, casual enough that I hadn't thought twice about attending as her +1. The practice had strung up simple decorations in the break room, a modest spread of grocery store appetizers and a sheet cake that read, "Congrats, Dr. Patel," in slightly crooked icing, the whole affair unpretentious in the way workplace celebrations usually are. It was there that Dr. Marcus Chen, a colleague from her previous city who'd apparently relocated around the same time she had, showed up unexpectedly, greeting her with the specific warm familiarity of someone with genuine history. "Delia Marlowe," he said, pulling her into an easy hug that lasted a beat longer than the standard professional greeting. "I heard you moved here too. Small world. We should catch up properly sometime. Old time's sake." "Marcus, I had no idea you'd relocated. When did that happen?" 6 months ago. New position opened up. Seemed like the right time for a change." He glanced my direction with polite curiosity. "And who's this?" "Rowan. Delia said, gesturing between us with an easy warmth I couldn't quite parse the specific meaning of. My best friend, practically family at this point. I stood a few feet away, holding a plastic cup of mediocre wine, watching an interaction that read, to my admittedly compromised eyes, as considerably warmer than simple professional reunion. The easy laugh, the way Marcus's hand lingered briefly on her shoulder as he told some story about their old workplace, the specific, comfortable familiarity of two people who'd clearly shared more history than a passing work acquaintance. Delia's laugh at whatever he'd said next carried an easy familiarity that made something tighten uncomfortably in my chest, a feeling I recognized, uncomfortably, as jealousy I had no clear right to feel yet, given that we hadn't actually named what we were to each other, beyond one honest conversation over reheated soup. I made polite small talk with a veterinary technician for the better part of 20 minutes, half my attention on the conversation happening a few feet away, watching Marcus find reasons to keep the conversation going, watching Delia laugh at things that didn't seem quite that funny, running through the specific, exhausting mental math of a man trying to determine whether he was witnessing genuine chemistry or just his own insecurity projecting meaning onto an ordinary reunion. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled through introductions, made polite conversation, drove Delia home afterward in a silence that felt heavier than either of us acknowledged directly. "You got quiet," she said, once we'd pulled up outside her apartment. "Around Marcus. What was that about?" "Nothing. Old colleague, right? Made sense you'd catch up." "That's not actually an answer, Rowan." I sat with the question for a moment, weighing the risk of sounding exactly like the insecure, presumptuous man I didn't want to become against the risk of letting something fester silently the way I'd let the bonfire fester for 17 years. "I didn't love watching him hug you like that," I admitted finally. "I know I don't have any actual claim to feel that, given we haven't defined anything yet beyond one very honest conversation. But I felt it anyway, and I didn't want to keep pretending I hadn't." Delia was quiet for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her tired eyes. "Marcus and I dated, briefly, at my last job. It ended amicably, mostly because neither of us felt anything particularly serious. I didn't think it was worth mentioning tonight because it genuinely isn't significant to me anymore." She paused. "But I need you to understand something, Rowan. I can't do this. Whatever this is becoming, if it's going to involve you standing quietly through moments like tonight instead of actually saying something in real time. I've watched you do that for 17 years. Quiet, careful, letting things sit instead of naming them. I need this to be different if we're actually doing this." "You're right, that's a fair thing to name. It's not a criticism exactly. I understand why you're careful. I'm the same way, honestly, which is probably half of why it took us 17 years and an emergency appendectomy to even get this far. But I don't want to build something on top of the same pattern that already cost us a decade and a half. I'll work on saying things in real time instead of 3 hours later in a parked car." "I hope so. I don't want another 17 years of almost, Rowan. I've had my fill of that particular flavor of waiting. So have I, for what it's worth. I think that bonfire taught me exactly the wrong lesson about caution. I've been quietly cautious about everything since, not just you, and I'm starting to suspect that's cost me more than it's ever protected me from. That's a genuinely honest thing to admit. I'm trying the real-time version, as promised 30 seconds after promising it." She laughed at that, some of the earlier tension breaking, and reached over to take my hand across the console, the specific, deliberate gesture of someone choosing connection instead of retreating into the old, careful distance. We sat with that for a while, both of us letting the weight of the conversation settle into something steadier than the discomfort that had preceded it. The street light outside her apartment casting long shadows across the dashboard, neither of us in any particular hurry to end the conversation now that it had finally started moving somewhere real. "For what it's worth," I said eventually, "I'm asking now, in real time, parked car notwithstanding. Would you want to actually try this? Not hospital paperwork, not a 17-year-old bonfire, An actual deliberate choice, made now, with both of us fully conscious and not medicated. Delia smiled at that, something warm breaking through the residual tension. I'd want that very much. Even with all the 17 years of baggage attached? Especially with all the 17 years of baggage attached. I don't think I'd trust it as much if it showed up without any history behind it. The baggage is sort of the point at this stage. The kiss that followed started careful. The specific careful of two people finally closing a 17-year gap they'd both been too scared to close properly the first time. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my jacket and pulling me closer with a certainty that had nothing hesitant left in it. And then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely, into something that made an ordinary parked car outside her apartment building feel like exactly the right place for 17 years of almost to finally resolve itself. We broke apart to the sound of her phone buzzing with a work notification, entirely unbothered by either of us, both of us laughing at the mundane interruption to a moment that had taken a decade and a half to arrive. For the record, I said, I'm keeping that consent form, the one with husband written on it. I asked the hospital records office for a copy, actually, a few days after your surgery, before we'd even had the soup conversation. I told myself it was just documentation I might need for insurance purposes. I don't think that was ever really true. That's either very sweet or a mild form of medical records theft. I'll take sweet. The alternative carries considerably worse legal implications for a man who works in emergency medicine. A year later, at our actual wedding, my sister found that hospital form in my desk drawer while helping me get ready and, without asking permission, had it framed as a wedding gift. The original clipboard consent form, Rowan Hale, husband, written in Delia's shaky, pain-medicated handwriting, hanging now in our shared hallway beside our actual marriage certificate. The accidental prophecy and its fulfillment displayed side by side. Technically, Delia likes to point out, whenever guests ask about the framed oddity on our wall, I called it first, 11 months before it was even true. She's not wrong, I tell them. I just took a while to catch up to her paperwork. I got to see Delia handle real pressure again about 6 months into our engagement, when an emergency call came into her practice on a Saturday morning. A dog hit by a car, brought in by a frantic owner who could barely speak through her panic. I happened to be there, dropping off lunch, and watched Delia transform instantly from the relaxed, easy version of herself I knew at home into someone entirely focused, calm in the specific practiced way that comes from years of training rather than performance. You're terrifying when you switch into work mode like that, I told her afterward, once the dog had been stabilized and the owner sent home with updates and a considerably calmer demeanor. I've been doing emergency surgery on creatures who can't tell me what's wrong for 12 years, Rowan. Panicking doesn't help the patient. Somebody has to stay steady, and it might as well be the person actually holding the scalpel. I don't think you know how to do anything without also managing someone else's crisis at the same time. You should see me attempt small talk at parties that aren't emergency adjacent. Deeply, embarrassingly unpracticed. I've noticed it's part of your charm. Don't push your luck, Hale. Marcus, for what it's worth, ended up officiating a friend's wedding the following year and sent Delia a genuinely warm congratulations text when he heard about ours, no hard feelings on either side, the entire jealous parking lot episode reduced, in hindsight, to exactly the minor, forgettable blip it always should have been. Delia showed me the text with visible amusement. Heard you're getting married. Good for you both. Old time's sake and all that. The same phrase he'd used the night we met, now landing as a harmless callback instead of a threat. My captain, who'd covered my shifts during Delia's recovery without asking many questions, gave a brief, characteristically gruff toast at the reception that mostly consisted of him admitting he'd known something was developing the second I'd started requesting time off for friend stuff with unusual frequency. Any man who takes 2 personal days for a best friend's appendix, he said, raising his glass, was clearly already planning on taking considerably more than that eventually. The clipboard form still hangs in our hallway, exactly where my sister placed it, and Delia still brings it up whenever the story comes up at family gatherings, always with the same satisfied, slightly smug delivery of a woman who'd apparently known something true about us both years before either of us was brave enough to say it out loud, sober and unmedicated. I think back sometimes to that intake nurse, handing over a clipboard she had no idea would end up framed on a wall 2 years later. No idea that a single hurried word written in pain and adrenaline would turn out to be more accurate than either of us understood at the time. Delia says she doesn't remember much of that specific moment, the pain and panic having blurred most of the fine details, but she remembers clearly the instinct behind the word itself, the immediate, unexamined certainty that if anything went wrong on that table, I was the person she wanted making the decisions on her behalf, whatever the official paperwork happened to call it. I didn't need 17 years to know that part, she told me once, months after the wedding, both of us doing dishes in the specific, comfortable domesticity we'd built since. I think I've known that part since we were 17, actually, sitting on a log by a dying fire, both too scared to close 4 inches of distance. The clipboard just finally gave me an excuse to write it down. I'm glad the appendix cooperated with the timeline, terrible as that sounds. Don't let my appendix hear you being grateful for its rebellion. It suffered for this relationship. The least we can do is not celebrate its sacrifice out loud. I laughed at that, the specific, easy laugh of a man who'd spent 17 years being careful and had finally, permanently, stopped. My captain still brings up the personal days occasionally, usually when new recruits ask why the veteran EMT gets a little sentimental about appendicitis calls. Best 2 days off I ever approved, he tells them, which is either genuine sentiment or a well-worn joke he's perfected over the past 2 years, and at this point I've stopped trying to determine which. Delia's parents, once they finally arrived at the hospital that first night, considerably later than the surgery, given the 4-hour drive, took the husband revelation with far less surprise than either of us expected, her mother later admitting she'd assumed we'd get here eventually, just perhaps not via emergency appendectomy. "We always thought it would be you two," she told me at the wedding, holding my hands with the specific warmth of someone who'd apparently been waiting almost as long as we had. "We just didn't expect a ruptured appendix to be the thing that finally pushed you over the edge." Neither did we, honestly, but I'll take it. 17 years is a long time to wait for a push. Some pushes just take longer to arrive than others. I'm glad this one finally showed up when it did. Delia's mother still tells the story at every family gathering since, usually embellishing some new detail each time. The exact shade of pale Delia's face had been on the phone that night. The specific speed limit I'd apparently exceeded getting to the hospital, details neither of us can fully verify but have stopped bothering to correct, given how much everyone seems to enjoy the retelling. I've made peace with becoming a minor character in my own family's favorite anecdote, mostly because the ending, at least, remains entirely accurate no matter how many embellishments accumulate around the edges. What would you have done if your best friend wrote your name on the husband line and meant it more than either of you realized at the time? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.